After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were rival superpowers. These countries hoped for friendship after the war, but their economic and political systems were completely different. The Soviets were communist, while the Americans were capitalistic. The United States was furious that Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939. Stalin wanted the Allied nations to invade Europe earlier than they did, which led him to distrust the U.S. Later, Stalin learned that the U.S. kept the development of the atomic bomb a secret from the Soviets. The United Nations tried to keep peace amongst these superpowers, but it soon became a place for them to compete for power. President Truman, now president after Roosevelt's death, met with Stalin and Churchill at the Potsdam Conference. In 1945, the Soviets prevented free elections in Poland, which Truman did not agree with. Truman believed that with the Soviets' refusal to allow free elections, it was a violation of the nation's rights. Truman pushed Stalin to allow free elections, but Stalin refused. Stalin's refusal convinced Truman that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had opposite ideas. The U.S. wanted to encourage democracy in other countries to prevent totalitarian governments, while the Soviets wanted to encourage communism. The United States wanted to gain access to raw materials in order to keep the economy prosperous, while the Soviets wanted to transfer the industrial equipment from Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union to help rebuild their economy. The U.S. wanted to rebuild European governments to ensure stability and create more trade for American goods, while the Soviets wanted to control Eastern Europe to balance the U.S.'s influence in Western Europe. The U.S. wanted to reunite Germany, believing that Germany would be less bitter about defeat, which would make Europe more secure, while the Soviets wanted to keep Germany divided and weak since the Germans started a war with the Soviets twice, which led to more than 20 million Soviet deaths. As you can see, the U.S. and the Soviets had complete opposite beliefs on what should be done. Stalin installed communist governments in Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Poland. These countries were known as the satellite nations. The U.S. followed a policy of containment in order to stop the spread of communism. The conflicting aims of these two nations in Eastern Europe led to the Cold War, which was a state of hostility short of war. The U.S. tried to contain Soviet influence in Greece and Turkey. The Truman Doctrine was instituted on March 12, 1947, which gave Truman $400 million in economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey. The U.S. sent aid, which greatly reduced the communist threat in these nations. In 1947, the Marshall Plan was proposed by Secretary of State George Marshall. It would give aid to all European nations that needed it. It was debated for several months until February 1948, when Soviet tanks pushed through Czechoslovakia and took the country over. This proved to Congress the need for strong, stable governments in Europe to resist communism. By 1952, Western Europe was flourishing, and communist parties lost their appeal to voters. As Europe began to strengthen again, Germany was still struggling. At the end of World War II, Germany was split into 4 zones occupied by Great Britain, France, United States, and the Soviet Union. In 1948, Great Britain, France, and the United States all decided to reunify their parts of Germany. The Soviets retaliated by holding West Berlin hostage. No supplies could get in, so the city faced starvation. Stalin believed that this would force the other nations to give up their idea of reunification. The United States broke the blockade with the Berlin airlift. Food and other supplies were flown into West Berlin for 327 days until Stalin gave up. The Berlin blockade increased Western European fear of the Soviets. As a result, 10 Western European nations joined with the United States and Canada to form a defensive military alliance called the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization. These nations all promised to protect each other if one of them was attacked. The Cold War has ended U.S. isolationism.